Alright, so particle effects. I've had a couple of students ask about particle effects. I'm going to show you a basic setup for creating a rain effect in your scene. Here's an example of what the end product is going to look like. This is after going from Maya into After Effects. Here's the composition. So we're using particle effects from Maya and compositing them over top of a static image. Alright, so that's our example, so let's get started. So we're going to use particle effects. We need to create a plane that the particles will collide with, and then an emitter. So the first thing we'll do is create a simple plane, polygon primitives, plane, just draw one out. I'm going to subdivide it 20 by 20. And then I'm going to zero out so it's in the center of my scene. So this will be the ground plane. The drops will hit. Let's name this ground plane. Or actually just ground so I know which one is which. So GROUND underscore GEO. There's our ground plane. And now I'll duplicate this to make my particle emitter. Duplicate. I'll raise this above, and this will be our rain emitter. I'm going to make my ground plane a little bit larger than my emitter, so we'll be able to catch some of the raindrops as it hits it before it rolls off the side. So the ground is slightly larger than the emitter. Alright, so let's set up our particles. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure our ground plane is the collider object. So we need to make sure this particle system knows to hit and react to this ground plane. So I'll select the ground plane, and if you haven't done yet so, change your environment to make sure you're in the FX environment inside of Maya. That'll give you options at the top menu. So now I've got access to the particle effects menu. With the ground plane selected, I'll go to End Cloth and select Create Passive Collider. So now all the particles will react when they hit this surface. And now I'll set up the emitter. So the ground plane is set up. Now I'll set up the emitter in the sky. I'll select the sky, and now I'm going to go under End Particles, and I'm going to select Emit from Object. We're going to emit particles from this plane. So under End Particles, Emit from Object. Now if I play this back, we have some particles falling. Now I'm going to set up my scene when I'm playing this back to have plenty of runtime so we can play out our particles. So I'm going to add or adjust my frames in my scene to 300. So I've got 300 frames in my scene, so if I rewind it and play back, I've got plenty of frames to run back my animation. So our particles are falling, and you can see they're reacting. They're attaching themselves to the ground plane, so they're reacting to what happens when they collide with the ground plane. So now we have our particles falling and they're colliding with the ground plane. So let's create another reaction. So as the particles fall, let's cause little splashes to occur where it hits the ground. So as if little drops were hitting the ground and splashing into smaller particles. To do that, we're going to use the particle collision event. So if we select our particles in the viewport, and under End Particles, we're going to go to Particle Collision Event Editor. Here's the particle event editor. So down at the event type, we're going to change to emit. So when the particles fall, they're going to emit another set of particles, or another particle event is going to happen, and it's going to emit, and then the number of particles is what we're going to adjust. So currently at default the number of particles is set to 1. Let's change that to a number of about 11, and then hit enter to accept. And then at the bottom left, click create event and close. So now rewind my scene and play this back. And now we're getting an event. As the particles fall, another particle emitter is being created with the event collider and causing a splash. And it's very big, so we're going to adjust that in a minute. So our particles are shooting everywhere. So what we need to do is cause these particles to terminate or stop after a certain period of time. And with particles, it's called adjusting the lifespan. So we're going to have to terminate the particles over a certain amount of time. So to do that, so right now we've got two particle emitters happening here. We've got the main particle emitter, and then we have the lower or the secondary splashes that are happening when it hits the ground. So this is our main particle emitter, and then our lower one is at the bottom. So if you select your second particle, it should be N particle 2. The first particle is N particle 1. The second one is N particle 2. So we'll select the N particle 2 and hit Control A to bring up the attribute editor. At the top of the attribute editor, make sure the tab is selected N particle shape 2. And to adjust this, we're going to change at the top. So you have all these categories. Open up lifespan, and at default lifespan is set to live forever, and that's what's happening. Our particles are collecting over time and staying in our scene. We need to have them terminate or die. So we're going to change the lifespan mode from forever to a random range. So we're going to change the lifespan from 1 to 0.1, and then the lifespan random to 0.2. And the same thing's going to happen to the main particle event. These particles are also living forever. So if we select particle N particle shape 1 and do the same thing, go to the attribute editor and under lifespan. This time we're going to change the lifespan mode to constant, and they are going to terminate after hitting the ground, shortly after hitting the ground, and it might take a little bit of adjusting and experimenting with lifespan settings depending on how your scene is set up, but I'm going to set my lifespan constant to 3.3. Now let's see how that looks now. So we'll rewind it and play it back. There, that's much better. So now you can see our main particles are coming down. They are terminating after a certain time, and also our little splashes are terminating after a short amount of time. So they're not living forever. Another adjustment we can do to our main particles is actually change the way these particles look. Currently they're little dots or points. We can change the shape of our main particles to a streak. So it's more of a motion blur effect. It looks like they're streaking down from the sky, so we can give that look at default. If we select our particle and particle 1 and bring up the attribute editor, and if we go under shading, so N particle shape 1, shading, the particle render type is currently set to points. If we select that tab and go down to streak, watch the shape that changes. It's from point to streak. And you can see it has like a leading edge, and it creates a little tail behind our particle. And this gives this illusion of motion and helps reinforce the idea of these particles flying through space. So now if I rewind my particles and play this back. These look a little more like raindrops. So again, your scene might be a little bit different depending on the scale that you're creating your plane. So you might need to adjust some of these settings, but these are the primary settings that we adjusted, and those are the ones you would have to adjust to fine-tune your scene. So if you select the particles, go to the attribute editor, most of your adjustments are in your end particle shape. So we adjusted the lifespan, and we also adjusted the shape or under shading. And you might inspect some of these other attributes that you might want to adjust or experiment with to try to get another type of look for your particles. So now we're pretty much done with our particle setup. We're getting ready to render these out. To render our particles out, we're only going to be rendering out just the particles, and we're just going to be using the particles as a white mask to bring into After Effects. Now we've created our planes, and they're going to render as well, so we need to hide these temporarily. So if we select our emitter in the sky and then shift select our ground plane and go over to the display layer, we can place these items on a display layer and hide them. So with those planes selected, I'm going to select the last icon to the right, which will place these planes onto a layer. And then if I click on the V, that will hide them. And I can also hide my grid. So now if I rewind my scene and play this back, I have the particles and they're still reacting, but the plane isn't in the way we do our render. Also in our render, we need to hide all the other elements, the icons that are in our scene, because we're not going to actually render this, we're going to actually create a play blast. We just need to capture screen grabs of every frame of animation here. So we need to render whatever's in our scene. So we need to have just the particles in our scene, and you can see as we created our end particle elements, there are icons that are in our scene we need to hide. So for our scene, we're going to go to Show and Show None, and then we're just going to show end particles in our scene, and that'll just show just the particles themselves. So now when I rewind this, we have just particles playing. Perfect. Okay, our scene's set up. Now our background is gray. We want to have a black background, so we're creating a mask. A mask is a black background, and then the white image is what's going to be revealed. So everything white will be seen through, or we will see, and then the black will be transparent. So we need to change our background to black. So if we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Color Settings, we can adjust some of the settings in our scene. So under Color, we'll go to 3D Views and the background color. If we adjust the slider all the way to the left and change the background to black and click Save. So now if we play our particles back, we've got a nice black background and our particles are white. Now we're about ready to create our play blast. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a play blast based on my render settings. So I'm going to check my render settings. So I'm going to go to the clapperboard with a gear, and the size of my render, I'm going to use an HD 1080 preset. So I'm going to change my image size to HD 1080, and that's what I'm going to base my play blast on, is this width of 1920 by 1080. So now if I place my mouse over the time slider and right click and hold and go to the option box for play blast, option box. Usually people render out movies, but we're going to actually render out static images of our animation. So I'm going to change the format to image. My encoding, I'm just going to do a simple JPEG. Display size, this is where I'm going to select my render settings rather than my window settings. The scale, I'm going to make sure that's at 1. And the padding, I'm just going to leave at 4. And then I just need to tell Maya where to place these images. So I'm going to browse, and I've already got a project set up for rain and images. And then I'm going to call this, let's see, drops.jpg. And then I just click on Play Blast, and the Play Blast will go frame by frame and take a render.